Everybody. Tonight we are very happy to have Ole Bouman here lecturing because we could keep him a night longer here in London because he was also at the ICE 4D Space conference which was dealing with interactiveness in architecture. This is also a long interest of Ole. An interest which he also tries to communicate through his magazine. Archis, it's about architecture. It's a Dutch magazine. And amongst publications in this, of working through this magazine, Archis, he is regularly publishing also. The latest book of him is called Battle for Time. Here, every time he tries to put forward his interest in new emerging design technologies and how these technologies could be beneficial for the relationship between people in our built society and how we could design and construct our environment in order to engender these relationships. So I'm very curious about the latest developments he researched on. So please, Ole.
Thank you, Martien, for your introduction. I would like to deal with architecture and publicity in different ways today. Not just the publicity of architecture, but also the techniques of publicity, which are very similar if it comes to publishing architecture or designing architecture, I believe. And these two are converging practices, which is also the title of my lecture. But before I start, I just want to be very topical and say something about something that's happening here right now at the AA, which is not so nice for me. I'm talking about the bookstore downstairs. Archis used to be on display there, but no longer. And I've been told that Derek Brompton decided, Derek, are you here? Yeah. He decided that Archis was too messy, which is quite a excommunication, I might say. It is true, it is messy. Archis is messy. And I believe to some degree that although I don't like this decision, of course, that I might be proud of being messy in trying to cover architecture today. Because if architecture is still about reality, sometimes, we all know, sometimes it isn't at all. But if it is about reality, it can be very messy. To produce architecture can be very messy. To represent architecture can be very messy. And well, let's say on behalf of the people, to experience architecture might be very messy as well. So it's not just killing to say that it's too messy. It might also be a source of inspiration. And I'd like to say something about my practice, and I hope that it reflects some of today's tendencies and forces that are around in architecture. That to decide to mediate architecture the way we do with Archis as a magazine is much more than a very arbitrary design decision. It has to do with finding the right interface of architecture and do a kind of parallel action, not just to do a secondary action like this eternal division of primary production, which is in matter, and then you have secondary production in words. I don't believe this is any longer a good let's say, a relevant distinction. I believe we are moving towards a practice where these two modalities of practice are two sides of the same coin. So what's happening with the screen now? There it is. Okay. I've been discussing the issue of time the last 2 days here in London on the occasion of the 1.0 event and 4D space conference. And one might say that if it comes to covering the topic of time in architecture, one might do it in a very classical way, which is, let's say, the ordinary architecture magazine. Later you can see it. You have this ordinary architectural magazine which has a linear narrative, and as so many of these magazines, you browse through it and you see, like in a landscape with a toured horizon, the different projects. I think most architectural magazines are very horizontal. They are one-dimensional, also in the way they treat their subject. You have also magazines that try to be two-dimensional. There is a certain verticality in the journalism, the criticism. It might be the narrative, which is trying to get to an apotheosis. It might be the layout of the pages, which has a certain verticality in it, and it might be the way the editor is trying to promote a certain point. For instance, if you have seen the last issue of Wired magazine, which is inhabited by Rem Koolhaas, you see a very strong verticality right on the cover already. When you see Rem looking to heaven with this aura around him, the aura of the saint, reminding anybody who has the knowledge of it, of this famous painting by Guido Reni with Christ and a crown of thorns on top, with it and representing Christ in direct communication with heavens. And I think that kind of verticality, the verticality of the prophet, might be, well, an ambitious thing for an editor to do, because it is at least trying to point at some near future or remote future and trying to lead the flock into a better world. But then there might be also a 3D coverage of architecture, which is not very well known, but we are trying to do that by making a magazine which can be used as a tool. It is much more than just coverage. It is something to work with, and later in my lecture I will show how. And then, of course, there might also be a fourth dimensional magazine making being presented, which has to do with a magazine that's very aware of its basic asset, the updatability and the reprogrammability of its content. What else is magazine making than trying to use an existing carrier, a vehicle, for new content every month, every 2 months, as this one, and trying to make a project through time. And there, exactly, by using time this way and being very aware of it, this practice might come close to new strategies and new practices in architectural design that are trying to adopt and incorporate time in a much more creative way than in the past. We all know that buildings were used as clocks in the past, measuring history and the commemoration as an asset, or the monumentalizing of values, trying to make them eternal, but dealing with time in the process. And of course, we all know about buildings in the past that were used as a clock for cyclical time, trying to accommodate sleeping, eating, working, and all these functions of daily life the whole day through. And this way of clocking time by ordinary, traditional, material architecture, we all know. But now there is a new emerging practice which tries to make architectural cinematographic, trying to use moving images, moving experiences, and make architecture into something emotional and psychological. So this is, I think, the starting point for my lecture, because what I would like to do is to explore the underlying value of that new practice and this new way to cover architecture, which is not just nice, maybe on the contrary. What I would like to present you is a couple of examples of how we are moving towards a society which is more and more keen on propaganda rather than argument. And to give you a first example, maybe this is just enough, a decisive example, I show you a small clip taken from the website of the Anschutz Foundation, Foundation for a Better Life. And I would need some more sound, but this is Born to be Wild from Easy Rider. Gratitude, pass it on. This is a clip that is the other side of a two-side media campaign to promote American values in the United States. And you can see driving through the Midwest huge billboards promoting certain values like gratitude or perseverance or strength or things like that. Repeating that all the time and having it on TV in a moving image, trying to say something very basic. This was the example of gratitude, a skinhead, and everybody expects him to be very aggressive, and he is actually in the beginning. This is the idiosyncratic motorbiker, and then also he can have a flat tire. And when he needs the public phone, he finds out he doesn't have a quarter. So he becomes very aggressive trying to slam that public phone, and then he's held by an older black woman who is giving him her spare quarter, and he can make the phone call he needed. And this moment of help is a kind of breakthrough of insight, and he says, thank you, I appreciate that. And then again, gratitude, pass it on. And this is the way we are now dealing with cultural messages. I think this is not just an isolated example. The laconic, lapidary, soundbite culture we have today is a very eminent way to communicate between power and the people, even between human beings, sometimes even face to face. So nation building, establishing social relations within a people, is done through very sophisticated techniques of manipulation. And to rephrase your Winston Churchill, one might say that never have so many been manipulated so much by so few. If you think about the Anschutz Foundation, for instance, and you think about the way he funded the Bush administration in its election campaign 2 years ago, you know more about the intricacies between power and values. And it is an extreme example, and I admit that it might be a very primitive message with a highly sophisticated communication strategy. But here, at the AA, everybody is concerned with shaping reality, literally, according to one's principles, and using techniques to convince people, I guess, and I hope. Well, if it comes to the discussion how to convince other people with your profession, and in this case, architecture, and if it's about trying to seduce people, to overwhelm people, to talk to people through space and through architecture, there is a basic distinction that can be made in the theory of communication. And this basic distinction has been brought forward perfectly by Aldous Huxley in his Brave New World Revisited. Huxley, one of the most famous social prognosticians of history, discusses in that second volume of Brave New World how one can get people to get along with one. And he makes this difference between two types of speech, and I think this can be expanded to many practices. One type is arguing, and the other type is propaganda. Argument is for intellectuals with a critical habit. It is meant to be convincing. He says intellectuals are the kind of people who demand evidence and are shocked by logical inconsistencies and fallacies. Let's say what the old Europe is doing to the new American policy these days, asking questions in terms of finding logical inconsistencies and fallacies. So intellectuals were against the war, for instance. They wanted a clear evidence of a threat. They wanted a clear idea that it is really the last resort to go to war. They wanted clarity and consistency in the objectives, and there weren't any. We know now that retrospectively there were other reasons than prospectively. They wanted a clear idea of what would come next. As we all know, we don't know. Propaganda, by contrast, is not about convincing, but about overwhelming. It is about seduction. It is about sentiments. It doesn't address the intellect, but passions. Huxley says about propaganda. Propaganda, on the other hand, teaches us to accept as self-evident matters about which it would be reasonable to suspend our judgment or to feel doubt. So, to go back to that war issue, people, whole nations worldwide accept there is a threat. There was a threat of Iraq, and now there is a threat of Korea, and that war is inevitable, that the enemy is of equal strength, they came to believe. Perhaps even stronger, since it was based on evil itself, owning weapons of mass destruction. They all believed it. Another important distinction can be made related to different kinds of engagement. That's an important additional factor if you think about that distinction. Because arguments need concentration. And propaganda is about distraction. It needs a spectacle. So, maybe it's a bit schematic, and maybe I put it forward a bit dialectically, but I believe that there is a strong division to be made between arguing either through architecture or through speech or whatever other communication means to ask people their concentration or to try to distract them. My basic premise, as you would expect, is that we are now living in an age of passion rather than proper thinking. It's about mass rhetoric very often. It's about plain sentiments. Think about stock exchanges these days. The volatility of many percent per day, just according to a new sentiment or an old sentiment being revived. Think about articles that you read every day. For instance, when I put this on paper, preparing this lecture, I was going through the New York Times and reading in one single issue of the New York Times, for instance, an article about a 50 years long prison sentence for an elementary theft, because you have this 3-strike rule in California, and if the 3rd strike is a very simple theft, in this case it were videos, a couple of videos from a shop, the guy would get 50 years. Or in that same issue of New York Times, a very reflexive article about new forms of interrogation of criminals. The way we could, the Americans could send some criminals that were likely to provide people with vital evidence to foreign locations to interrogate them in a different way before they got back to the US to enjoy civil rights. Or the arrestment of a guy who was wearing a t-shirt stating "give peace a chance" in a shopping mall, not complying to the rules of that semi-public space. Or the article about the cowboy boots of Daniel Libeskind, in which his taste for new boots was combined with a description of his background as the child of Holocaust survivors. Or the description, in that single issue still of the New York Times, of Saddam Hussein maybe not being a human being, but a virus. And you might expect that this metaphor will pop up very soon if he will not be found very quickly. That the virus goes on and the virus needs to be tackled. So finally, to refer to that single issue of New York Times, there was an interview with Donald Rumsfeld, who argued that in these days we have to be prepared for 3 things. If you want to be cautious, and we need to be cautious, we have to be prepared for 3 things. The first thing is the knowns. We have to be prepared for the knowns. Then the second thing is known unknowns. If you do intelligence services, you have to work on the known unknowns. You can anticipate certain things in examining and assessing threat to your society. But you, of course, you can anticipate and you know them, but you still have to do the research. But then there is a third thing you have to deal with as Secretary of Defense, which is the unknown unknowns. So that was his basic distinction. You have to deal with the knowns, the known unknowns, and the unknown unknowns, which is, of course, a justification to do anything. So this is, it might be a gross example taken out of context, but I'm sure that you will believe me if I say that the very next day, the next issue of New York Times would have the same kind of collection of articles about weird phenomena. So to come back to a professional discourse, my basic question would be, how can design respond to such a world? How can it deal with it? How could it respond, or should it respond? To go back to this distinction between propaganda and argument, fundamentally, one would say that modernist architecture was really for intellectuals. If you think about Le Corbusier and his coherent oeuvre, this shelf of books building up a certain argument over years, a life devoted to a cause. He said architecture is le jeu savant, correct et magnifique des volumes sous la lumière. It is scientific, it is logical, it is about beauty. All 3 qualifications of good architecture are very much in need of the faculty of judgment. And before you can judge, you need to study. Well, in most people's not so humble opinion, this design modernist design was extremely boring, not really sentimental, not really playing the sentiments. But also postmodernism was not very sentimental, at least not sentimental enough, because they were still buildings. They were still about form. They were still about stillness. They were still about objects, dumb objects. If you go through that famous book by Charles Jenks, The Language of Postmodern Architecture, and all the examples he gives, and the diagram he gives about the ongoing progress of different styles towards this fundamental breakthrough in the history of architecture called freestyle classicism, you see it's still all about a meaning that stands still. I think if it is about still, dumb buildings, they are fundamentally too slow for propaganda. Maybe architecture is kind of resistant to propaganda to some degree, at least as you define it as dead matter, standing still. Too laconic for sentiments. And in that sense, if you really think that architecture can still be defined as the stilled representation of meaning, about shelter, about occupation, about accommodation of function, about construction, about matter, about space to move through, it might be resistant to propaganda. It is too awkward for the flux, the speed you need for propaganda, the suggestiveness, because you can check the argument. You know, even if it is suggestive and fast, the very next day it's still the same building. You can check it, and finally, even if it's born out of the will to propagate, it becomes an argument, and maybe a very poor one. But again, that's not exactly the definition of architecture I would propose here, because just as the last 2 days has proven in this conference on 4D space, 4D architecture, and you see how many of the architectural genius is invested in much faster architecture, to animate it, to make it filmic, to make it ephemeral, to make it reprogrammable, to make it updatable, and all these other qualifications of blurring the boundaries of the static object. One knows that there is another definition of architecture emerging. So, from the old definition, it is very easy to think ultimately of a powerless, completely instrumentalized craft. From the new definition, there is so much to explore and to examine and to study that there might be fundamentally found a new mandate for architecture, and the big question would be, are you willing to make the jump? So, my question would be, how can design regain a potential of a dimension to think in? It will be 4-dimensionals, that's for sure. I believe that to do that, to explore that new mandate, well, I would suggest you to see it as a way of publishing, to deal with architecture as publishers do. And I will give you a couple of examples how that would look like and how that would work, how that would be workable. And of course, if it is about publishing, you have good press and tabloid. Well, of course, also publishing, the very practice of publishing itself did change a lot under the same conditions I just described. If it is true that social relations are no longer being established through the notion of adjacency as we are used to in the past, we need to get together, like here in this room, in a very traditional situation. We are adjacent to each other. But we all know now that architecture is moving more and more towards this dream of the ultimate connectivity from anybody, anytime, any place, through all senses. This dream of the ultimate connectivity which is far beyond the adjacency imperative. If you think about the way we finance architecture, that sometimes, in very rare occasions, there is too much money, and most of the time there is too little. We had an example, Ron Arad, talking about working for some Arabic sheikhs, where the rich man's burden, the real problem was that there was a limitless budget. But of course, most speakers would refer to situations where there was no money at all. Think about the difference in clients, the sheikhs, the people who have too much money to think about a proper destiny for it, and of course on the other side the anonymous bodies who have no particular interest in interesting architecture. Think about the way we reorganize our building process. Think about we merge public space and private space. Think about the way we specialize, that you had process architects and product architects and design architects, and the differentiation of the practice. Think about the emergence of consultancy, this mediating caste, this mediating group that had taken command in today's practice. All these factors that has an effect to architecture practice has also a great effect on architectural publishing, because they change the subject of architectural of criticism. And I again don't believe that you can keep on focusing on the old discipline, the constructive, the material, the program, the type, the style, etc. Although many magazines still do, and they have to, because the building industry is paying for it. What I would like to propose to get up to date as a publisher is, just as the architects have to think from the task, to get back to this basic premise of an architectural commission, which is to organize social relations in some way, to connect or disconnect just according to the wishes and values of the client. And then, if you think about that, to rephrase the task of architecture within this new situation, one would define architecture differently, and one would define publicity of architecture differently. And if it comes to publicity, I come back to this notion of how to cover it. I believe that you can no longer cover architecture. It is not enough. To think about this time division that you have, as I said before, this primary production first and then secondary reflection, I believe, is becoming very obsolete. What we try to do is not to cover, but to discover, to find creative moments, just as architects do, pockets of resistance or pockets of creativity where you can do something which is suggestive enough and which is relating people. And I will show you what I mean with that. So, time-based publicity, event-based publicity, action-based publicity, that's where it's all about. I would like to show you a few examples of that. First, physically. For instance, as I said before, beyond 2D, in 3D and 4D, you might give people something to chew on, not just consume the magazine, but give them something like a tool. Here we have, for instance, your ticket to fame. This is a special issue on populism, neo-populisms, and how architecture deals with it. It's all over the place, also in England, even under the name of Labour. So we have here a monument maker, ticket to fame. And it gives you something to memorize, to study, and you won't have to carry that whole issue with you all the time. But just this ticket to fame and the way you can work on fame and create or reinforce the visibility you need to get fame. Or there is a page which is your ticket to spectacle. It gives you an example of what do you need, a checklist for a great mega event. So this is a checklist about the usual sponsors you need to approach. A whole list, and you can probably name them. I won't repeat that. But then, of course, what will be this event about? A subject for the spectacle, and a target group you need to address. Is it music? Is it sports? Is it leisure? Is it future planning? Is it entertainment? Is it music? Whatever. So a subject. And then, of course, a key activity list. What do you need to provide the people with if you want to have a successful mega event? So there is a whole list of programmed, scripted activities that you may propose or organize. Then venues. What venues are likely to be used for this? And then the scale you have to think in terms of visitors, in terms of space. And then, of course, there is also a list of preferred beverages. So, after having used that list to create your own spectacle, you may also be interested in the waste a day after. So there is a checklist what to clean up afterwards. So you can take that with you and start organizing. And then there is another page which is a page to study decisive speeches. And what kind of rhetoric do you have to use to overwhelm people? And for this page, we were studying a variety of recent mass meetings, lectures, where there was a certain emergence of this soundbite. There was a representation of this soundbite rhetoric that you should need to make your point. So this is an example of work pages, but of course, in a more metaphorical sense, one can also use the magazine and to reconfigure the magazine. And every page has been perforated, so you have here a poster to explore the notion of a crowd and what the power of the crowd is. I won't go into that, but it's easy. So then you may find some projects that you particularly like and want to keep a little while in your office. So you tear out that page and put it on the wall and get inspired by it. But that's not the only thing. There is also a flyer . So if you go through the magazine, under all pages there is a flyer that you can rip off, if you can say it, torn it off from the page, and make a game with it. So we have game proposals, suggestions to visit websites, pocket quotes, and all kinds of things that you may use in daily life and map your world through using the magazine likewise. So the magazine is a tool to work with, and to give you a little more than just the sound of the way I tear it off, I will show you a few examples more. I go through a couple of pages. So for instance, we are proposing a page to fax to us, if you don't like it. go through. I flick to this a bit quickly. Or you can personalize your magazine using the white strips. You can also fax to an author who has written an article in Arcus and you want to respond. You can write a letter to your neighbors. Dear neighbor, let's not greet one another in the future. In a special issue on individualism and suburban developments. Or a manifesto for the G8 meeting in this time it was in Geneva, where you get the manifesto, and on the other page you get the same manifesto. Just the page is printed twice, and you keep one for yourself. And as all manifestos, you give one to the other. Or pages that were already missing at the moment of purchasing the issue, that you can only see what should have been there if it was complete. So here there were missing pages displaying piercings and tattoos of famous architects. Or a black fax to the Museum of Modern Art stating, I agree with the critical article of John Thackeray in Argus number 2. Workspheres was very successful but not very interesting. I just want to let you know this. And on the other side was a white fax that you could send if you totally disagreed with the author and you would show that you appreciated this exhibition. Or we made mini posters for both the architect and the client of the GVC center in Guadalajara. So you see Todd Williams and Billy Tsin, to have them on your wall, but also Jorge Vergara, who made it all possible and who was sent in the same package to us. Or you could use the text of a page to go to a print shop and make a statement on your t-shirt stating the way you feel working for a famous architect or becoming famous too young, which is a very common phenomenon in Holland. Or we made a quiz asking which books had been wrapped by this paper. And this was a rare explanation of the use of these strips. Or we were proposing ringtones for your mobile, which were related to the architecture of a number of architects. And you could program the sound and you would see how the work of these architects was, how it would be translated into sound. And there was a special issue on perversity in architecture, and we had all kinds of tests to let the reader get more aware of his own perversity. Or you could define retrospectively the program of a certain building. And then we also do a lot of suggestions to get to websites that you would never believe that would exist. Right. As you see, what we try to do by creating moments rather than covering the existing still buildings, by creating active moments of intervention, is to get into the dialogue, to create a dialogue space between reflexivity, edited reflexivity, and unedited reflexivity of the reader, trying to connect and reach out to others and spatialize the content. But it wouldn't be enough to do just that. What we also try to do is to, through a website, to be active in the network space and to complete a conceptual triangle of 3 different spaces, the interaction between and the dynamics between 3 different spaces. The physical space that has been the old responsibility of architecture, the network space on the net, and the mental space of the people. And to work with the overlap between these 3 spaces, creating interfaces that might dynamize the interaction between the 3. So I give you just briefly an example of how we do that on our website right now, and within a few weeks we are trying to dynamize it even further. For instance, we had a special issue on Dublin. So I go here to the archive. Not Dublin as the city, the capital of Ireland per se, but Dublin, the D-O-U-B-L-I-N, city, which has at least 2 layers of experience. Oops. So, for instance, there was an article there by Bill Mitchell from MIT, trying to work out an idea of rewriting James Joyce's Ulysses, which is about taking a walk through the city of Dublin and showing what can happen mentally in the stream of consciousness in one day walking through that city. And what would it mean if this Joycean figure, Stefan Daedalus, would have been owning a PDA and a mobile phone, and when at home there would be all kinds of devices to get in touch with him? Could he have this stream of consciousness? So what we try to do is to recreate that Joycean walk through the city by making kind of parallel statement, editorial statement, next to that article of Bill Mitchell, and creating an interface to go to Dublin directly. So what you got is a map of the city of Dublin with small sections, and you could choose a certain area, let's say here, and then you see a close-up at the right, the lower right corner, and a recent shot from an existing webcam that is available in that area. So one could go through Dublin and see recent shots by webcams. But to be more, you could also update that webcam image to go to the URL to which the webcam was attached. And by clicking on this URL, you would go to that webcam. And you would see the most recent, and again, the way life unfolds at that specific spot in Dublin. So you see, although this issue is 1.5 years old, that we are now here in May 2003, and you see that it is much better weather in Dublin than in London. Another example, you go to another place, or to the M50 that was there, that was the This is an interesting phenomenon. I'm now clicking to another webcam URL, but you don't go to the webcam shot. What you see is another image that has been made by the tourist office of Dublin. They have checked several of the webcams already from our mapping device and have concealed it by a much more attractive image of their city, which they like to promote, the way they like to promote Dublin. So within 1 year you saw how a mapping device we present on the web was appropriated by the tourist office of the city of Dublin, trying to improve the impression. Well, another example of how we try to create moments of interaction and to spatialize the interface on the web might be this. For instance, we presented an issue on Africa and the way within the oeuvre of one man one could deal both with the African city and with the fashion of Prada. And we presented a map, a URL map of Africa, because it needs some explanation. In the Prada store in New York, there are displays. How many Prada stores are there in the world? Well, quite a few. Now a few completely new ones, but there are none of any Prada stores in Africa. So you see a world map redrawn on the basis of the parameter: is there a Prada store? And Africa is non-existent on that map. So we, as a kind of counteraction, we did an investigation to very interesting cultural websites in Africa and create dialogues between these sites. So I won't go to these websites, but you could follow this dialogue there. So we are trying to use the web space to reanimate and refocus the digital reality there, and informing physical reality in the process. So that's for Arcus thus far. We are trying to work with other organizations as well, and trying to reach out this approach, this strategy to dynamize the overlap between the three spaces that I talked about before: the mental, the physical, and the network space, and to create other activities or other events where this could be explored more in detail, because with a magazine you also have to deal with very basic facts that not always allow to innovation. For instance, I worked on an exhibition as a curator in Ljubljana a few years ago, called Manifesta. It's a biennial of young emerging art in Europe. It will be in San Sebastian next year. It was in Frankfurt last year, and the time before it was in Ljubljana. But working there, I became extremely bored with the ordinary strategy to display art that was possible there in Ljubljana. They would provide the curators with just the ordinary venues like the National Museum and the Modern Art Museum with their white cube spaces. So I decided to make a kind of parallel show on the web, creating projects that were had both a physical and a digital implication. So you could go there and, for instance, a few projects, and you could, for instance, FAT did a project for virtual manifesta, and Ginger Freeman did a project using Active Worlds software. Laura Kurgan from Princeton University did a project on using in a creative way satellite technology. And there was, let's say here, Oliver Ressler, who presented a project that was explicitly refused by the Slovenians because it was about a critical statement about the bombing of Belgrade. So you could go to the project and get an interface that could be walked through by clicking to specific aspects of his discourse and making kind of spatial adventure through the reflection of the meaning of the war in Yugoslavia. So this project of Oliver Ressler could only be done on the web, where others could easily have done in physical space, and a few even were. Then another example of trying to reach out with publicity to actual practice, not just art practice and the art of curation, but also design, is a project that I did for, worked with a Dutch office, Design Under Construction, for the Museum Insel in Berlin, where we were asked to provide this new museum site, which has the ambition to become the Louvre of Germany, with a communication strategy. And I will show you a few examples of that, how we could work on a kind of integrated concept to help people navigate in that awkward area. Awkward in terms of space, but also awkward in terms of historical, let's say, historical overload. I just want to zoom into one specific. Well, this was an idea to come up with a logo which tries in a very tense cultural atmosphere where we are talking about the clash between civilizations to create a dialogue between the classical and the Arabic cultures, and using both as an example of how we cannot do without the legacies of many cultures. And this is a scheme of what we're trying to do with light, trying to create a navigation system within the city of Berlin, making a kind of coherent experience if you cruise through this area. For instance, using the existing devices for just lighting light on the street, but repeating them by reinventing light points around and in the further distance of that area, so you could slowly experience the emergence of that area as an important cultural nucleus. And this is again another example how we were using the railroad line that goes right across two major museums with no physical, let's say no other implication than an aggressive rupture, and we were trying to use the technique of filmmaking to give the subway passengers a cultural experience. Right. So that was another example of how the techniques of publicity can inform design practice. To come to a conclusion of this discourse of reinventing design practice through the dimension of publicity, I would like to show one more example that some of you might know, which is a project which tries to do this in the most condensed way, and a project that must be seen as a pilot project to combine different time-based techniques to the existing spatial design practice, because it's in the end just a visitor pavilion. It's a physical thing, it's a space, it's a place, it is an occupation, it is shelter, you can go inside. It's truly architecture, but it tries to be informational in many respects by making the iconography updatable, by making the volume reprogrammable, and by creating an adaptive structure that is supple in itself. So this is a project I worked on with Cas Oosterhuis from Rotterdam, and which is time-based per excellence. So you see how this space frame, that is the structure of this volume, has pneumatic bars that can expand and contract according to different inputs, physical inputs by people who show up there, but also by connecting this building to a website where people could play with the building from a remote location. And inside you see the example of how the complete surface of the building is done through LED screens and projections, where the multimedia programming becomes much more important than the eternal iconography one wants to adopt. So in a way, if this is time-based, you can no longer talk about a fixed program, but you need to think in terms of modes. Like we know we can be in a certain mode and we can be in a certain mood. And this building is a mood engine in a way, because you can program it as a research space, you can program it as an exhibition space, you can program it as a disco space, as an artist space, as a studio space, etc., just according to the parameters that are related to the program rather than the pre-existing values of the designer. So it is very much about sharing the values with the client and finding more clients, because this is not just for one client who needs square foot. This is about a client who needs time, broadcasting time. This building emits meaning rather than embodies or materializes meaning. So I think that's an important aspect of my course. What it is all about is a time-sharing practice where we no longer think in terms of accommodating program in space, but giving program time to be emitted physically through one-dimensional broadcasting devices, but also on the net in a hypertext way. So I think, as an example, as a pilot project, this might be, let's say, the final stage of this emerging publicity strategy within architecture. What I mean is that if it's true, you can create a building like this, which is fusing spatial and digital disparate ranges of experience, and it would mean a big step. It would also be beyond redundancy. People were used to the authenticity of a building just because the day after the day before it was still the same building. We are now more and more used to situations that are completely have been completely changed within a cycle of a few hours. If it's true that we are like we have been told at the other conference, that we are moving towards a time-based and experience-based design practice, we have to deal with as spectators and as users of architecture that we need to adapt ourselves to completely different situations, even if the spatial coordinates are still the same. So we have to deal with the updatable environments, the reprogrammable environments, And this means that the static character of architecture is no longer at stake, which means also no longer the repetitive qualities of architecture, in favor of a more flexible and informative response to the public. And I also may emphasize the aspect of the moving structure, which is maybe a kind of weird thing, especially when you just think that this is the project. It is not. Of course, this is a mode. This is a phase, a very arbitrary choice of a wide range of possibilities you might explore with this kind of structures. But that's the very essence, that this adaptability of structure to use, for instance, to low usage, or, when there is not this peak usage level at stake, is something that makes this project kind of ecological one. So, if it is updatable, this architecture, and if it does put architecture on air in the form of transmission time, we have to once again realize that it can be reprogrammed with content. That we need to have a curatorial vision, the staging of the environment rather than the definition of it. That we can program it with market forces, but also with public meaning, with artistic meaning, just according to our own standards of civilization. And as a client, and that's also very important, you don't just rent the space of this, you rent the time. And I've called this a digital Gothic in a way, because it deals with a new way to deal with windows. It might be seen as stained glass in a way. It is a cathedral, but this time it's not a cathedral to look up, but to go through and to work through and to connect. And in that sense, connectivity might be seen as another dimension of heavenly inspiration. It is architecture of light, like the Gothic, but it is also very light. It is architecture without a contingent form, without territory, without client, and without representation per se. It is without a fixed iconography. And my main point, if it comes to this issue of converging practices, this kind of buildings, they don't need a developer anymore. Not even a designer which has the key to the meaning and the reception of that building. Of course it needs designers, but not one designer. So it's multitasking. And since this is all about staging the contemporary, and it needs a curator, it also needs, beyond the developer, a publisher. I think that's the basic point I would like to make today. That if architecture becomes time-based, and there are specialists in time-based practice in the field of multimedia, it's crystal clear that these two practices, the spatial specialist and the time-based practice specialist, might make a deal and work together. And what I've seen the last 2 days on the conference was exactly that. That you see in these kind of projects the end of the lonely author. Today, this morning, we got a couple of presentations from the back office. We have seen animation movies from Zaha Hadid's projects, from Herzog and de Meuron projects, and we got a preview, no, let's say an insight in the incredible sophisticated practice of the animation software engineers. Or we got an insight in what the civil engineers, the people who are doing the constructions of these buildings, are working with. If you talk to the people of over Europe, and you think about what people like Cecil Belmont and Rice and all these guys have done for innovating architectural practice, and you think about how much that is informing the reception of architecture by, let's say, lay people, then you also feel the gap between the way it is offered and the way it is actually done. So there are many more of these examples of people who are very much advanced in using time to inform their design practice. And these people, strangely enough, are not very much coming to the fore. I think there is a tradition of discourse where we think that the author of architecture is the spatial specialist and not the specialist in time. And I truly believe that it won't take long that these two creative momentums come together and will be credited likewise. Thank you. Please, no problem. Are there any questions? No? Oh, there's one. Left.
Well, thanks so much. Just one question. I mean, the last part, right, very provocative, but programmable architecture is no longer about form or aesthetics, right? Because it can be programmed by different clients. It's wonderful, but what we've seen so far, including your own project, is that this kind of programmable architecture also goes along with some aesthetics, right? Because if your statement would be 100% true, then why even bother with making blobs or whatever? Why not just have a cube and cover it with screens? But what we've seen so far is that the use of computers resulted not only in architecture screens, but also in very particular kind of forms, which in fact define a very particular, very distinct aesthetics. Is it only a temporary stage before something else?
Yeah, that's why I said explicitly that this was an arbitrary moment of, let's say, a whole spectrum of possibilities to work with these kind of techniques. And I completely agree that using the imagination, let's say the imaging of the blob, is weakening the argument to the extent of thinking that it is about the blob. But of course, the blob might be seen as here as the example of the liquidity of form, and nothing more than that. And we would like to re-emphasize that the blob should not be seen as a form proposal, but as a moment proposal.
When SMLX came out, I thought one of the most interesting phenomena that it created was the way that it broke out of the kind of closed realm, architectural discourse and publications, kind of opening up art forum and seeing it reviewed. And it sort of proliferated massively, and obviously I think that had signaled a huge turning point in Rem's career. And, one could say that gigs like Prado and many others, in a way, could be traced to that book, and the way in which that book proliferated and migrated throughout the world. But I'm just wondering, in terms of, because what I really like about Arpius is the way in which you, in one of the few magazines that subvert or undermine, the sort of
It's messy.
yeah, the messiness that is a sort of greatest cardinal sin of most architectural publishing, is it not? We're used to the depopulated pornography of perfectly airbrushed images of buildings, and you fuck up with that, which is, I think, is really interesting. But what I want to know is, maybe you can't even answer this, but does it still only preach to the already converted, in the sense that does it still, if I want to buy it, I know there's only a couple of places in London I can buy it, which are mainly architectural bookshops. So, I mean, is there an intention for it to go beyond, in a way that I think Rem with Ammo is quite interesting. I love the fact that, they redid Lucky, the trashiest of Condé Nast's publications. that aspect of, I think, what one has to offer as an architect in vis-a-vis the rest of culture and cultural production. It's very interesting. I'm just wondering whether that's an intention with artists, or whether that does happen at all, or whether it actually stays within a certain confinement of architecture.
Well, it should happen much more than it does. We have a legacy, and this magazine exists for 80 years already, although not under the name of Arcus, but its predecessors started in the 20s, and it was for many people who know it already for quite a while, and who are at the core of the old profession. Let's say the material architects or the practitioners. They hate it. They think it's messy. Yeah? It's messing up architectural practice and the representation of that practice. And there is a new group who is growing and who likes it, and we need to find them much more. That's for sure. Because there is, even among these, let's say, more adventurous minds that might be open to this approach, an idea that you have special titles for this kind of approach, which would start with a brand new strategy, rather than developing from a certain practice into a new one, which also means you take with you the burden of the tradition, the heritage, the reflexivity, and the ways to visualize and to voice that. So I would be glad if it goes faster, but it's just a matter of maybe another reason is, I think it's partly reception, but also just my fault, because I need to work on that magazine. And this is not really a big commercial endeavor, because the market thinks in terms of niches, and the niches are defined along the lines of disciplines and specialties. So in the landscape of architectural magazines or space magazines, you have them for design, you have them for landscape, you have them for buildings, you have them for even for building techniques and even demolishing. You have all these specialties within the building column, but it's all vertical, and we would like to try to get across these disciplines and find this creative momentum, even in the practice of demolishing buildings. Sometimes we deal with that, how to get rid of buildings. So and then for someone who is completely brainwashed in the niche of demolishing, or the other to elevate buildings. One thinks it's not for me. So it's more like finding the right people who are having this state of mind that cuts across these niches and these columns, than to find another niche. So in terms of marketing, there is also a new strategy to be devised, and well, I'm already very busy. So that also may slow down a little bit the work.
How's the interface between the hard copy and the web-based work going to develop? What sort of strategies do you envisage for the future in terms of?
Well, three things. One is that we are reproducing the content of the magazine partly on the web. Which creates a growing dynamic interface, dynamic archive, and we are now designing a new interface by which you can go crisscross through different years of Arcus, and see how, if you are interested in the issue of time, for instance, or the issue of celebrity architecture or any other aspect, you could see that we have written about it sometimes a year ago, 5 years ago, whatever. So the condensation of content and the offering of people's own trajectory in that. And the second device is to propose fora, to give people the possibility to react by different means to the content. And the third is, as I showed, animations to re-edit the content web-based.
Do you see any of these things having an impact on the development of this architecture that you were showing towards the end? By that I mean that when you made your three categories and you ended up with the emotive or basically this architecture that's more responsive. I mean, of course at the A we're very sympathetic to this position under programs like URL or MTech that in some ways in terms of responsive environments are following similar trajectories. But I can't help thinking that sometimes for the purpose of the argument, one ends up inevitably pushing the kind of the propaganda argument instead of the intellectual argument in some ways, where things like this responsive programs are still, obviously, as you said yourself, are very much in their early stage. And so the spectrum of their responsiveness are very limited, often to do with shrinkage and expansion, or responding to kind of very, very basic kind of criteria at this stage. And of course, this is like the moment when the computers have been developed. I mean, that also needs to go on, and it needs to be developed. But in some ways, it seems that the propaganda then also doesn't really look at other circumstances, other conditions, other kinds of architecture that might still, because of this vision or because of this framework or because of the network, can also be seen with different eyes. So just I wonder whether you have any comment.
Yeah.
The criticism seems to start with a kind of intellectual proposal and constructs in some way its own propaganda.
Well, basically, what I try to do is to show that you can work with the tricks of propaganda, even within argumentative context. You know, what I'm trying to do here for a very select group of people is to make an argument about new strategies in design. And of course, it's very condensed because there is so much more in that. And what I try to do with this final project, ultimately, is to show that in an integrated project, you can deal with animated surfaces, interactive surfaces, online, putting architecture online, and try to fuse remotely located areas by means of interesting interfaces, for instance, projections of one site into the other site, and trying to expand, like the Hall of Mirrors did in the 18th century, to use multimedia to expand space experiences and things like that. And a fourth degree to do that with net environments, so digital. So 4 basic strategies to expand the power of experience in architecture. And nothing more than that. It's a kind of condensed example that it is possible to do it all 4. And of course, it all boils down to a physical representation of this. We need a physical example how it would work, and then we can shade the whole argument and see whether it really becomes a kind of toy for Coca-Cola or Fuji, let's say 3D billboard, or something which is a mandate for architectural design in depth. So of course it's all condensed in a way, and it's much more than that. But I was particularly I was very glad to see the last 2 days that on these 4 levels of using multimedia techniques, projection, sensor technology, and things like that, there is made strong progress in the last few years. There were good examples, sometimes even very low tech, not this suggestion of high tech, but very low tech, using hardly any bandwidth to connect people in a different way. So if architecture is about establishing social relations, and if social relations are now redefined through our way we communicate with each other, living in one place, working in the other, having a relationship in another place, etc., the dispersal of experience and the way we use technology to reconnect, then you see that there has been made lots of progress, and I think in terms of making it visible, you just have to go through these examples and try to get inspired by it, and have pilot projects or find clients, because that's probably the decisive factor, that you get clients along with you to make it work, like in the past. Yeah. Another one? Yeah.
Just to play kind of devil's advocate, in the world of complete mobility, nomadism, interactivity, and going from cliches, on the one hand, it's very exciting to redefine architecture as time-based art, but what about the psychological need for something stable, right? If all commercial architecture, of course, would be very happy to become time-based because you can change, right? Advertisements, you can change propaganda. I mean, wouldn't we still have a need for, the minimal white space? I mean, isn't that the reason we like, for example, museums, because it's actually one of the few places where you don't find this kind of mobility on screen. So can we also mention architecture kind of resistance, which would be about form and not about time?
Sure. At the other lecture, I said that there is this dream of connectivity to anybody, anytime, any place, through all senses. That is the dream. And the price we have to pay for that dream is the nightmare to be connected and to be intruded by anyone, anytime, any place, any place, through all senses. If we are connected, on the level of brain implants to the other, we are also intruded on that level by the other. So if that's the dream, I'm pretty aware of the other side of that story, which is a nightmare, and that we would like to be in a kind of let's say isolated position every now and then, if we are allowed to, and I'm not so sure we are, because there is already this paradigm shift from technology that can be switched off to technology that can no longer be switched off. So we are already underway to be open to any intrusion without our consent. But I'm dinosaur enough to know that there might be a need for peace and quietness. And I would suggest, if you don't like the moving form, you just put it in the slumber mode. So that's another mode then. Okay? Thank you.